Hey, and welcome to PHA, that's Pulp Hero Audio. Today we're going to be comparing Conan comic books, specifically three different eras of Conan comics and their respective first issues. Keep in mind that we will only be looking at the issue ones of those eras and not any side projects or sister titles like the Savage Sword of Conan. Only the main titles only of those respective eras. So, first in this series, we will have Conan the Barbarian #1 from the year 1970. It was published by Marvel Comics, written by Roy Thomas, with art by Barry Windsor-Smith. And then after that, we will examine from 2003 Dark Horse Comics' simply titled Conan #1, written by Kurt Busiek, with art by Kerry Nord. And finally, we will look at 2019's Conan the Barbarian #1, back again at Marvel Comics, written by Jason Aaron, with art by Mahmoud Asrar. And please forgive my uncultured American tongue if I didn't pronounce that last artist's name correctly. All right, let's go back to 1970, where we find that Roy Thomas is starting us rather early in Conan's life, and we seem to be moving in chronological order, unlike the Robert E. Howard stories, which could take place at any point in time in Conan's life. I believe Thomas was following the outline of the chronology laid out by authors L. Sprang de Camp and Lynn Carter, who had brought Conan back to the masses in a big way in the previous decade of the 1960s with a series of paperback novels that sported the painted artwork of esteemed artist Frank Frazetta, which, I think for a lot of people, those images painted by Frazetta on the covers of those books, that really stuck into, the American or the world's consciousness as to, that was Conan. So, speaking of artwork, let's just take a look at the Barry Windsor-Smith artwork from Conan the Barbarian #1. Is it good? Yeah, it is. Barry Windsor-Smith is quite good. But when you look at that, is that Conan? Yes, I would say yes. I would say if you showed me that image, without any titles or word balloons or anything like that, and said, "Hey, who is that character?" I'm going to identify it as Conan the Barbarian. But to me, being totally honest, to me, Conan looks kind of scrawny there. But I don't think I can entirely blame Smith for that. Most of us have been inundated with images of a much brawnier Conan, from those aforementioned Frazetta images to other comic book artists like John Buscema and those that followed him. Of course, you got the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, more recently Jason Momoa, artists like Boris Vallejo, who also painted lots of Conan images that ended up on book covers and prints and posters and things like that. So with all of that imagery out there that we've seen all these decades, it's no wonder that Barry Windsor-Smith's Conan looks a little malnourished here. But he's obviously still quite muscular. He's toned, he's fit, And I think we should also keep in mind that Conan is still quite young here, only a teenager. Yes, Conan was more strapping than most young men his age, I think. But, how much is too much? I don't know. I'm torn. On one hand, I can see what Smith was going for, but then again, I've seen high school football players that could go toe-to-toe with this version of the Barbarian. So, anyway, on to the story. The story itself here in Conan the Barbarian number 1, 1970 edition, is pretty much a straight-up battle with plenty of action as Conan has joined up with a band of Aesir warriors of Asgard, which Roy Thomas spells differently than Howard did in his stories. That was so as not to confuse readers with that other Asgard, the one that Thor is from. Thor, who was also being published by Marvel Comics at the time and continues to be so. But I digress. Conan and his Aesir comrades, they are battling a band of Vanirmen of Vanaheim. Now, if you're familiar with Howard's stories, you would think that this would naturally lead directly to Robert E. Howard's story, The Frost Giant's Daughter, which, you can listen to a recording of that on one of my other videos, as well as a pretty lengthy discussion and commentary about that particular story, The Frost Giant's Daughter. But DeCamp, Carter, and here Roy Thomas, obviously, they're all rolling with the notion that yarn, The Frost Giant's Daughter, takes place a bit later in Conan's life. Now, I think that just shows that DeCamp and Carter, either they simply got it wrong, or they ignored the truth on purpose, preferring to perhaps present Conan in a different story earlier on. Now, the Darkstorm chronology by Howard scholar Dale Ripke, which places The Frost Giant's Daughter first among Howard's tales chronologically, I think is the more logical of the two, if you ask me. And again, speak more about that in another video about the chronology of the Conan stories. So, back to our comic. After the battle, we're then introduced to a creepy old shaman who just happens to have a beautiful daughter. You always got to have a beautiful woman in most Conan stories. And he has an object of magic and power called the Star Stone, some sort of jewel that fell from the sky that shows him all manner of things and visions and so on and so forth, and a variety of different effects. I thought this was appropriately weird, otherworldly, very Howard-like. It also shows a new reader to Conan's world, if this comic was your first exposure. It also shows that Conan's world is not grounded in, utter realism. The supernatural, things like that, is a reality in Conan's world. Then Thomas throws some red-winged demon things at Conan and his stalwart blonde companions to fight. Maybe this was exciting, but it does seem kind of an odd time for such a thing in Conan's life. Because this, after all, is supposed to be a Conan who has not yet faced the God in the Bowl, another Howard story, where Conan confronts a weird supernatural sort of thing. He hasn't discovered the secrets of the Elephant's Tower yet. Of course, in this timeline, he hasn't encountered the Frost Giant's daughter or anything like that. At this point, he was still rather uninitiated in the ways of the weird in those tales, so it seems kind of odd that he would have already faced something like, a legion of red-winged demon creatures. I don't know. But anyway, I think with all this fighting and action, it might also be mentioned at this point that for all the sword-swinging action and whatnot, there is actually very little actual violence, and certainly no blood or anything remotely gory in this comic. Now, this is one thing, a pretty big thing, that makes this comic removed from that gritty pulp world of Robert E. Howard. Now, this was a comic whose principal audience at the time was still considered to be kids. And it was bound by the strict guidelines of the comic book code, which, had a lot of things about what you could and could not depict in a comic as far as violence and gore, and even down to the way the hero, the main character, is depicted, which could account for some of the discrepancies between Thomas's version of Conan as opposed to, say, Robert E. Howard's original version. Of course, that also meant that Conan's interactions with women, such as the beautiful shaman's daughter in this very issue, are rather tame. But, all things considered, I think Thomas did a pretty good job given the structure under which he had to work. So, thanks to the Starstone, we now get a vision of Conan's world. We also get a nod to another Howard favorite character, King Kull. And we get some of the history of the Hyborian world and that of Conan himself. Which I think is a good thing, because this is supposed to be for people, for comic book readers, especially kids. This is kind of their introduction to Conan, so they need to know a little bit about the background and the history of this world and this character. In this same vision, we also get a glimpse of the future that tells the reader that Conan will one day wear the crown of a king. Now, I think this is fine. It doesn't spoil anything. After all, Howard's very first published Conan tale, The Phoenix on the Sword, established Conan as a king. So going forward, you always knew that eventually Conan was going to be a king. Okay, fine. So then, as Conan leaves all this weirdness behind, we get a taste of the fact that Roy Thomas was a man who definitely knew how to turn a phrase. Thomas was a solid prose writer in his own right. He writes in this very issue, "Night-winged thoughts flit across Conan's brain, memories of the dread deeds of the day just done." Marvel loved its alliteration. "The slaying of a valiant friend. The marvels," nice plug, "of an invisible world revealed images of many towered cities and dying continents and kings. Aye, wasn't there something about a kingdom? A vision of Conan as a monarch of some unguessed-at land. But already the image fades, too long ago and too fantastic to trouble the mind of a youth who has neither dagger nor venison to sustain him. The moon is a white watching eye, the journey home is hard, and there are no realities worth the wishing, save food and a finely wrought sword." So, hey, nice job, Roy. So, as nicely written as that is, we now see that Conan himself actually saw the vision of the Starstone. Now, I'm not sure I really like the idea that Conan has some knowledge of his own future as king, like it's almost some sort of prophecy or great destiny waiting to be fulfilled. Now, granted, Thomas does write that the image fades, but I know in at least one later issue, maybe more, Conan will recall this vision again. So, not sure how I really feel about the idea of, Conan knowing that much about his future. Like he's got some end goal in mind, if you will. But on the plus side, I do like the simplicity at the end, as nothing more than food and a good sword. That's good enough for this Conan on this day. Forget stuff about kings or kingdoms or anything like that. Just a good meal and a good sword. That to me is very Conan. Even worthy of Robert E. Howard himself. So guys, that's my review of 1970s Conan the Barbarian from Marvel Comics, written by Roy Thomas, with art by Barry Windsor-Smith. I would invite you to be sure and check out my next video, hopefully coming sooner rather than later, in which I will compare this comic to a new era of Conan comics as we jump into 2003's Conan #1 from Dark Horse Comics. Hope to see you then. Later.